Hello, I'll be presenting on Snowflake Virtual Warehouses. My name is Joseph Kambarakis. I've got our agenda listed here. We'll begin with some slides on virtual warehouses. Then we'll take a look at the documentation. We'll go through a worksheet demo. We'll then do a knowledge check. And then at the end, we'll have some time for questions. But I want to emphasize that if you do have questions as we're going through the slides or the demo, interrupt me at any time and ask. We don't have to keep the questions until the end. We're looking at the Snowflake architecture, and there's three layers here. There's the cloud services layer, the query processing layer, and the database storage layer. In this deck and demo, we're going to focus on virtual warehouses, which are part of the query processing layer. This you can think of as the compute piece. So how do all these pieces fit together? Let's say we have a table. That table is going to exist in database storage. And if we want to read that table, we would write some query such as select star from table. We submit that query to the cloud services layer to make sure that we have access to that table. And then it will send that query to the query processing layer, where a virtual warehouse is going to do the reading and the computation piece, and it will connect to that database storage to read the table. So this is the compute, the part where the query occurs. So what is a virtual warehouse? It is a massively parallel processing compute cluster. So there's a lot there. So let's break it down into parts. It is massive. So it can be as little as a single node, but it could also be up to 512 nodes. So very, very, very large. When you have that many nodes, you can do lots of parallel reads, parallel writes, and those reads and writes are part of the processing that you'll do. This you can think of as a virtual machine in that it has some allocated CPU, it has memory, and it has temporary storage. This isn't where you're going to store your tables. This is just some storage associated with the virtual machine that you're using. Again, each warehouse can vary in size from one to many nodes. We'll talk about the size in a couple slides, and we'll see it again in our demo. You can also have many warehouses. You don't have to have just one warehouse. We saw on that slide before, there was 3 different warehouses in that query processing layer. Each virtual warehouse is independent. They have their own RAM, their own CPU. They're not going to compete with resources or share resources with each other. If you have a single warehouse, then it can have multiple queries, and those queries can compete for resources and processing, but each warehouse is independent. So if you have one running, it won't affect another one. How do we create a warehouse? We can create it programmatically or through the Snowsite UI. Creating it programmatically is actually very, very easy. And I'm always hesitant to say something is very, very easy, but in this case, I'm sure everyone will have it memorized by the end of the slide. It's really just 2 keywords and an identifier: create warehouse, and then you give it a name. And that's all you need to do to create a virtual warehouse. So very, very concise, small, simple code. We can also do it through the UI. There's a blue warehouse button that lets you add a warehouse, which will take you to this GUI, and then you provide the name right here. And then there's some optional arguments. We'll talk about the optional arguments, but things such as comment or advanced warehouse options, you don't have to put anything in. The only required argument is the name. We saw that drop-down menu with size. We talked a little bit about the size. The size can vary from extra small up to 6x large. So it just goes extra small, small, medium, and very natural ordering. Each size will double. So extra small is 1, and 6x large is 512. And it just goes 1, 2, 4, 8, and so on. The larger sizes are more expensive, and but this pricing is linear. So if you double the size, you double the price. So you don't have to start thinking about pricing too much when choosing the size. You'll get double the resources, your query will run twice as fast if you get a larger machine. Some of the larger machines, the 5x and 6x large, are in preview on a couple of the clouds. So it's always really important to refer to the documentation on both the pricing and the sizing and availability, because these things are always going to change. Just because something's in preview now doesn't mean it won't be in preview in 2 months. It will probably be GA'd, and there'll probably be new things that get GA'd in the future. So always refer to the documentation on the sizing. We'll take a look at the documentation in a few minutes. There's some other features, optional ones that we can put in. There's auto suspension and auto resumption. Auto suspension is going to turn off a warehouse that isn't being used. So if there's no queries, if there's nothing processing, it's just sitting there idle, it will turn off after 600 seconds of being idle. This is to conserve resources and to reduce billing. You only pay for a warehouse that's running. So when it's turned off, the billing stops. And this is a time that you can adjust. So we see the default time is 600 seconds. In the UI, it's going to list it as 10 minutes, but you can change this value. There's also auto resume. This is the ability to restart or wake up a cluster when submitting a query. So if the cluster's on, this isn't going to have any effect. But if the cluster's off and someone submits a query, then it's going to restart the cluster and run that query. So you don't need to think about, okay, first I need to turn the cluster on, then I need to submit the query, then I need to turn it off. You can just submit the query and it'll turn on by itself, and then it'll turn on after a few minutes of being idle. There are some enterprise features that we'll talk about now. One of them is multi-cluster. Multi-cluster is the ability to have multiple clusters. There's 2 modes for this. There is maximized and auto scale. With maximized, you'll just choose this from the dropdown, or you can specify it programmatically. And instead of starting a single cluster, it's going to start multiple clusters. You can set the min and max in this case, and the min and max need to be the same value. So if you set them both to 5, what it'll do is instead of starting 1 cluster, it'll start 5 clusters. This will give you more parallelism, more compute, and the ability to process a lot more data. With auto scale, what you'll do is set the min and max to different values. Then the number of clusters is going to change based on need and demand. So let's say we set the min to 1 and the max to 3. If a lot of people start submitting queries and the queries are taking a little while, then it'll add more clusters. If people go to lunch and stop submitting queries finish, it's going to reduce the number of clusters. The key thing to keep in mind here is this idea of scaling out. This is adding more clusters. So more demand on resources, more queries, it's going to add more clusters. This is different from scaling up. Scaling up is getting a larger size. So let's say we have a small and we go to a medium warehouse. Well, that is scaling up. But if we have 2 warehouses and we go to 3, that's scaling out. We can automatically add more clusters. We can't automatically change the size. We can manually change the size, and we'll see that in our demo. There are some other properties on warehouses that we can adjust and change. We can set a resource monitor. We can add a comment. We can have query acceleration. You can set timeouts for how long a query will run, how long it will queue. And these are all very nicely listed in the documentation, which we'll take a look at in a moment. There's 2 key parts to the documentation. there is a guide and a SQL reference. Let's take a look at those now. This is the virtual warehouse guide. This is going to talk about all the different configurations in a detailed manner with explanations and references to documentation there. So there's overviews, what snowpark is, those kinds of things. The other part is the SQL reference. This is going to go over the SQL syntax. And this is what we're going to use a lot in our demo. So here we see the very, very basic SQL syntax. The optional arguments are listed in brackets. So we see that create isn't optional, warehouse isn't, and name isn't. Everything else is optional. So again, that very, very simple example of create warehouse with a name. All of these different properties are things we can set. So we saw size, for example, cluster count, min and max, and these are all explained below. So let's take a look at our Snowsite UI. Under the admin tab, there are all the active warehouses. Right now, we see that there are 0 warehouses. But here's that blue button we talked about to create a warehouse. And when we click on that, it brings up that GUI, and we can provide a name. Size is a dropdown. And again, we see that linear scaling of credit hours, optional comment, and then some of those optional arguments like, do we want auto resume, auto suspend, how long for the auto suspend? And then there's also a dropdown for warehouse. We also have a worksheet where we'll look at some of the syntax. So here's our first example. Create warehouse, compute 1. This is going to create a warehouse with all default arguments. I'll run this query. And it tells me it was successfully created. It took about 200 milliseconds. Let's check back in our warehouses and we'll refresh. Here's that compute 1. And again, it's going to use all default arguments. No queries. Here's our default. 1 cluster min and max, so fixed size, extra small size there, and there's the default auto suspend. We can do a describe warehouse. It tells us when it was created, the name, and what it is. We can then programmatically drop it. And then we go back here and refresh, we see it's dropped. Let's create another warehouse, compute 2, and now we're going to add in a comment. The comment here is a string, first attempt at warehouse. Successful. We can do a describe there. The describe doesn't show the comment. If we go to our warehouse tab and refresh and click on compute 2, now we see that comment right there, first attempt at a warehouse comment. So we'll show up there. We can also use the UI to edit, suspend, drop, or transfer this warehouse. So we'll do a drop through the UI. Now let's look at some other examples. We can create compute 3, and we're going to put in the size. Warehouse size is small. So instead of the default of extra small. We can do a describe. Again, when it was created and the name. And let's take a look at that. So we see the size there is small. What if we provide the wrong size? So here, we're going to write SMAL. So just a misspelling of small. And it will tell us invalid property type. So let's take a look at our documentation for size. Here, it does list out all the valid values. So we can write X small or X dash small. X large or X dash large. We can write small, but again, we can't have any misspellings there. So we have to provide one of these arguments, and we see the default right there. What if we provide it in this manner? Warehouse size equals small, so 2 string arguments. It doesn't like that property. What if we don't have the equal sign? So in this warehouse 6, if we don't put in the equal sign, it doesn't like it either. What if we put it in this way? So without quotes on small. That one is successful. You can drop it. So again, we have to have config, not as a string, equals, and then it can either be the string or keyword. So small in quotes or not in quotes, or any of the other valid sizes. Now, what if we try to access a feature that we don't have access to? So this max cluster count, for example. If we take a look at that max cluster count, it has to be from 1 to 10, and it's going to be for multi-warehouse clusters. And it says for Enterprise Edition, which I don't have. So we'll run this, and we'll set the count to 2, a valid value. And it's going to say, this feature is not enabled. So you do need to be on Enterprise for that feature. Now let's try to create a cluster and then alter and change it and try to scale it up. So making a larger machine. So we'll do create warehouse. You'll see that the keywords do highlight there. Compute 9 with warehouse size in equals, and then I can do X small. So that's created successfully. Let me refresh here. 9 is X small. Now I want to change it. So let's take a look at our documentation for how to change it. So there's an alter. And it looks like the syntax is alter warehouse, the name, and then what you're going to set the parameter to. Alter warehouse, compute 9, set warehouse size equal, and I'll change it to small. I'll run that. Here, I'll refresh. So we see it says extra small, and now it's small. So we sized it up. So we can size it up manually. What we can't do manually is change the min and max, the number of our clusters. That's our warehouse demo. Now we'll take a look at some of the knowledge check questions. The first one, what is the difference between scaling out and scaling up? Scaling out is adding more clusters. Scaling up is changing the size. So going from 1 to 2 clusters is scaling out. Going from extra small to small is scaling up. Our second knowledge check, what components do you need to configure specifically for multi-cluster virtual warehouses? For multi-cluster virtual warehouses, you need to set the type or mode to be either maximized, so fixed number, or auto scale. Fixed number is going to start with however many you set. Auto scale is going to change based on use. Our third question, what happens if you set the min and max value to the same? If you set the min and max value to the same value, this won't let it auto scale. So it's going to be a fixed or maximized size cluster. Let me know if you have any questions, and that's the end of our demo.